A whistle screams from nowhere. The 313 train is coming. In the square, the sky mirror unveils every sin, shattering trust, turning neighbors into enemies. Amid the chaos, one deputy and a chained prisoner face the choice: board the train or let the whole town burn to ash. If you were there, which side would you choose? Welcome to WestDreamTales, where the Wild West comes alive through stories of grit, mystery, and redemption. Here, cowboys face impossible choices, towns hide unspoken sins, and legends ride the rails of fate. Like and perhaps comment, subscribe now, and join us as we bring the forgotten frontier back to life, one tale at a time. The desert wind cut across Sable Ridge. It carried dust, heat, and silence too heavy to breathe. The sky above glowed faintly red, as if the day itself was running out. In the center of town stood a strange clock, tall, iron, built with hands that ticked backward. All pointed toward a single hour, 313. No one knew who built it. No one dared touch it. But everyone stared, waiting, fearing what would happen when it struck. That morning, the square was full. Merchants left their stalls. Children clung to skirts, whispering as the clock counted down. Then the air bent, a shimmer like heat on the desert floor, and a mirror appeared above the square, vast, glowing, alive. Faces shone across its surface, names written in burning script, and secrets no one wanted told. A miner stealing whiskey, a widow meeting a stranger after midnight, a blacksmith hiding stolen gunpowder. The crowd turned savage. Accusations flew. Fists struck. The mirror only showed more. They called it the sky mirror. Others whispered of the lantern of truth. Whatever its name, it stripped the town bare. Through the chaos walked one man, Deputy Evan Mercer, coat buttoned, hat low, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, haunted by memories of hospital doors and letters marked denied. Beside him moved Cassian Rook, hands bound in iron. A strange clockwork band clamped to his wrist. It ticked faintly, gears turning on their own. Every time it stirred, danger soon followed. People said it gave him 3 heartbeats of warning, bought with blood and paid for in scars. Rook's face was calm, unreadable. He looked less like a thief, more like a soldier returning from a war no one else had fought. Still, the town shrank from him. Evan's hand rested near his revolver. He had never killed a man, but today might force him to cross that line. His duty was clear on paper. Escort Rook to the station, put him on the 313 train, but nothing in Sable Ridge was clear anymore. The clock ticked backward, and the ground began to glow. Lines of fire traced across the dust. They curved, tightened, formed a circle shrinking around the square. Those outside the light blurred, edges melting away like watercolors in rain. A rancher tried to run. He crossed the line and vanished, leaving only his boots smoking in the dirt. The crowd screamed. Mothers dragged children inward. Men shoved, cursed, fought for space within the shrinking sanctuary. From the stone pillar by the clock came a voice, flat, cold, without mercy. All remain within the circle, survive until 313. The town was trapped in its own arena. The air pressed down like a lid on a coffin. The only road led to the station, and whatever waited beyond. Evan pushed forward, boots striking the glowing dirt. Rook followed, silent, watching the horizon with the patience of a man who had seen this dance before. A figure rose on the saloon roof, dark coat, wide hat, smile sharp as a blade. Harlan Creed, leader of the Meridian Riders and collector of debts that couldn't be paid in coin. His voice rolled across the square. Mercer, give me the prisoner, hand over Rook, and Sable Ridge will live. The people turned, torn between fear and rage. Eyes begged Evan to obey. Others cursed him for walking on toward what might be their doom. Evan said nothing. He kept moving, hand tight on his gun. Creed only laughed, the sound like nails on coffin wood. A rifle cracked from above. The bullet shattered a beam beside Evan's head. Splinters stung his cheek, drawing blood that tasted of iron and destiny. The clockwork band whirred once, urgent as a heartbeat. Rook spoke low. 3 heartbeats. Right side. Evan yanked a guard left. A bullet tore through empty air where the man had stood. The guard froze pale as bone, understanding how close death had whispered his name. Above them, the sky mirror shifted. This time it showed Evan, not secrets of others, his own buried shame. A younger Evan, standing at a hospital door, a letter in his hand. Words burning, petition for healing, denied. Insufficient funds. The crowd gasped, seeing the deputy's private pain laid bare. Evan's jaw set hard, but his eyes never left the station. He would not give Creed the pleasure of seeing him break. The circle shrank again. The only safe path funneled toward the rails, and the backward clock thundered in his ears like an approaching storm. 3:12, 40, 3:12, 20, 3:12, 10. A whistle cut the air. Not near. Everywhere at once, as if the sound came from between the spaces of the world. The tracks at the end of the street trembled. The lamps on the station flickered between this world and another. The horizon split with silver light that belonged to no earthly dawn. Evan quickened his stride. Rook's smile was thin as paper. Almost there. Almost time to pay what's owed. The whistle screamed again. Closer now. The ground shook like a drum stretched too tight. The clock dropped another second toward its inevitable conclusion. 3:12, 00. The square exploded into chaos. Half the town surged toward Evan to force his hand. The other half clawed each other as more secrets poured from the sky like poison rain. Creed raised his arms high, a dark preacher at a twisted service. One man, or your whole town. Choose. Mercer. Choose before the choice is made for you. The circle drew tight, a glowing funnel leading only to the station. Evan and Rook ran. Bullets ripped the air behind them like angry wasps. The sun burned hot, unforgiving. The station loomed at the end of the street like a courthouse of final judgment. Rails hummed like a living thing, singing songs of elsewhere. And on the horizon, the train appeared, not rolling along tracks like any decent locomotive, sliding like a blade through the fabric of the world itself. The whistle howled one final note. The sky split open to receive it. The circle sealed behind them with a sound like doors slamming shut on all escape. Evan shoved Rook forward toward the platform. The station doors shook in the rising wind that smelled of metal and distant rain. And all of Sable Ridge held its breath for what 313 would bring to their doorstep. 1 week earlier, Drywell County wore a thin moon like a bruise across its face. The telegraph clicked in the dark office, quick and nervous as a dying man's pulse. Deputy Evan Mercer warmed his hands over a lamp and waited for dawn that seemed reluctant to come. A rider came with a sealed packet before the rooster found his voice. Iron wax, no crest, only the numbers 313 pressed deep like a brand. Inside lay orders written in a hand that knew no mercy and offered no explanation. Escort Cassian Rook to Sable Ridge Station by the given hour. Keep him breathing. Keep his wrist device fastened. Keep the chain taut. Do not look into the mirror that hangs above men's hearts, for it shows more than flesh can bear. No signature, no explanation. Evan folded the page and felt it bite his palm like a live coal. He tucked it inside his coat as if holstering a second weapon, one that might fire when he least expected it. Miss Helena Calder, the sawbones, packed lint and laudanum with practiced efficiency. Her hands were steady as a surgeon's, gentle as a mother's. Back by Sunday, she asked without hope, knowing the answer in the way his shoulders carried the weight of unspoken truth. They collected their prisoner at the old stone jail, where shadows pooled thick as molasses. Rook stood when the door opened, neither proud nor broken. Iron kissed his wrists, and the strange band clung there like a second bone, or a parasite that had learned to be useful. Pike checked the wagon harness twice, muttering prayers under his breath. Bell counted cartridges and found the number wanting. Both men had seen strange things in their years riding for the law, but neither had seen anything quite like the device that whispered warnings to its wearer. The road rose and fell, as if tired of going forward. Camp came with a low fire and coyotes singing thin songs to stars that seemed farther away than usual. Pike snored like a saw through green wood, and Bell counted constellations that didn't match any map. Rook sat quiet in his chains, then spoke without prompting, as if the darkness had asked him a question. I walked the halcyon line before I ran from it. He spoke as a man telling the truth to the dark, knowing it would listen without judgment. Not a brakeman, he added, firelight dancing in his eyes. A wayfinder. I measured thin places, spots where one world rubs shoulders with its echo. The halcyon line, he explained, was a railroad that ran between what is and what might be, a ghost track that appeared where reality wore thin, carrying cargo that had no name and passengers who paid in ways that banks wouldn't understand. Evan watched the fire. Not Rook, but his ears caught every word. Ghost stories, he said out of habit. Stories, Rook agreed, that learned how to ride steel and buy tickets with human misery. Miss Calder frowned at the band, her medical training making her see the raw skin beneath the brass. It hurts your skin. It buys me 3 heartbeats of warning, he said simply. I pay in blood. It pays in time. Fair trade. Evan's hands were steady, but the lamp flame bent as if pushed by invisible wind. What is the voice that gives orders? He asked. Some hear wind in copper pipes, Rook said. Some hear a woman keeping ledgers with a pen dipped in regret. She has a name among railmen, he added softly. Aurelia. She sings the orders. She files the debts we owe. Every town that borrows time must pay in truth. Evan tasted iron on his tongue, as if the very words had weight. Why does she hunt you? Because I broke her arithmetic, Rook said, and the fire snapped as if agreeing. Made her books come up short. At Blue Water Crossing, the lantern opened the sky like a wound. Men clawed each other while the circle closed and truth spilled out like blood. A little girl, couldn't have been more than 7, stood alone at the rim, about to be erased like a mistake in the ledger. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I stepped outside with these 3 heartbeats burning in my chest. The world tried to spit me out, tear me apart for breaking the rules. I dragged her in and dared the ledger to write it down as debt. Pike rolled over, muttered a prayer that sounded more like a plea, and slept the sleep of men who had seen too much. Calder listened with her mouth set thin, understanding the price of such heroism. Evan watched sparks lift and die like unsent letters to a god who might not be taking mail. They moved before sunrise, when the world was still deciding what color to wear. Distance pinched after noon, as if a mile had shrunk to half its honest length. Bridge Hollow's windmill threw a shadow the wrong way, pointing toward yesterday instead of tomorrow. A chapel bell rang itself hoarse with no rope moving and no hand to pull it. Pike crossed himself and whipped the team despite an empty road stretching ahead. Bell inventoried cartridges and would not say the number aloud, as if speaking it might make it smaller. From the ridge they saw Sable Ridge below, red as a coal bed left burning through the night. Evan smelled lamp oil and fear long before he heard voices carried on wind that tasted of metal. He felt the letter under his coat, small and heavy as a stone in his chest. In the square, a pedestal waited where no pedestal had stood the week before. Copper lines chased each other like living vines across the stone surface. Under a grating slept a sheet of black glass as dark as a well and twice as hungry. Rook did not stare at it with curiosity or fear. Lantern of truth, he said with the weariness of a man naming an old enemy. Set where a cut will come quick. Miss Calder hissed softly, as if the words themselves burned the air between them. Why show such things to innocent people? She asked. So the town does the cutting for the line, Rook answered with bitter understanding. Less blood for the ledger to account for, fewer names for the bell to toll. They took rooms over the livery where the boards smelled of old hay and older storms. The wood groaned with memories of horses that had carried men toward deaths they couldn't imagine. Evan could not sleep and did not try, knowing that rest would bring dreams he wasn't ready to face. He unfolded his orders in the lamplight, watching how the edges had blurred with sweat from his palm. The warning about the mirror seemed to pulse like a living thing. He read it until the letters danced and his eyes watered from staring. He wrote 4 names on a slip of paper: Rook, Pike, Bell, Calder. He hesitated, then added Sable Ridge in letters that looked like a prayer. He hesitated longer, then added his own name and folded the paper twice, as if doubling the paper could double the protection. At breakfast, Pike spoke to his plate like a man confessing sins. Word is, Harlan Creed has 50 men in the hills. 50 looks like 100 when a town is scared, Evan replied. And fear makes every shadow a gunman. Rook ate with the careful precision of a man who had learned to appreciate every meal. Creed will wait until the lantern starts its work, he said between bites. Then he will offer peace in exchange for me. Clean hands. Simple trade. Would you take it? Miss Calder asked Evan directly, her eyes steady as a judge's. I carry orders, he said, but the words felt hollow as a dry well. He did not say what else he carried under his ribs, the weight of every choice that had led him here. They walked the square in daylight, when shadows were honest and the sun hadn't yet learned to lie. Children tossed pebbles at the pedestal and missed without missing, as if the stones chose their own path. The air hummed with potential energy, turning projectiles aside like an invisible hand brushing flies from a sleeping face. Rook nodded toward the bell tower, the water tank, the depot cornerstone. These hold the world still, he said with the authority of a man who had measured the bones of reality. If 2 fall, the layer slips and the town falls through. Evan touched the depot cornerstone and felt a cold that had nothing to do with shade. The stone was warm from the sun but cold underneath, as if winter lived in its heart. He pulled his hand back and wiped it on his coat, trying to rid himself of the sensation that something had touched him back. A boy with no shoes and 2 old eyes brought a card that reeked of gun oil and bad intentions. Mercer, it read, in handwriting that smiled without lips and promised things that good men didn't think about. Sundown, trade the prisoner for quiet, refuse, and let the mirror preach the sermons in blood. Evan burned the card behind the stable, watching the flames eat the words like hungry mouths. Ash floated on the air, then sank in the horse trough like a small ship carrying a cargo of regret. He did not keep paper he could not trust, and he trusted nothing that came from Creed's hand. Night woke the lantern with all the ceremony of a funeral. The mirror rose from stone like a slow moon climbing a sky it had no business visiting. Faces surfaced in its dark shine with names burned beneath in script that hurt to read. A man who skimmed coins from the church collection box. A woman who took winter bread she had not earned while children went hungry. A pair of brothers who sold a neighbor's calf and split the whiskey money while the neighbor's family went without. No one spoke at the first revelation. By the 4th, silence broke and stayed broken like a bone that would never heal straight. By the 7th, fathers would not look at sons, and wives turned away from husbands they thought they knew. Evan stood under the hotel awning with Rook chained to a post like a dog, but the prisoner's eyes were clearer than those of his captors. Evan watched the tide of shame turn to heat, then to something darker and more dangerous. The circle had not yet begun to form, but the town was already shrinking from itself. Trust, once cracked, spread fractures through everything it had once held together. Soon there would be nothing left but anger looking for a target. Rook leaned closer, his voice barely audible above the growing murmur of accusation. When the whistle blows tomorrow, the circle will draw tight like a noose, he said. Creed will not rush. He will herd the town's anger toward us. Make them do his work. Miss Calder kept her hands tight on her medical bag, knuckles white with tension. Inside or out, she asked, meaning the circle, meaning survival, meaning the choice between damnation and erasure. Inside, Rook said firmly. Outside is where the world gets thin, where people fall through the cracks between one heartbeat and the next. Evan tried again to sleep and failed more completely than before. The night tasted like copper pennies and unfulfilled promises. He thought of that hospital door 7 years past, of his wife's face through the window, of the letter with 2 words that had ended everything. Petition denied. Toward dawn, the iron clock groaned and began to move backward with terrible purpose. Men who had laughed at omens stopped laughing and started praying. Women put bread and water on doorsteps as offerings to whatever gods might still be listening. Evan tightened Rook's chain, testing every link. "Why me?" he asked one final time, though he feared he already knew the answer. "Because the ledger has your name written in red ink," Rook said with something like sympathy. "Aurelia wants you to witness what comes next. She wants you to remember." "What happens inside the train?" Calder asked, her medical mind needing to understand the mechanism of the madness. Rook's eyes did not leave the window and the lightning sky beyond. "There is a brass altar in the gauge room," he said like a man reciting scripture. "Orders are written there in terms no earthly court would recognize. 2 names open the ledger," he added with the weight of experience. "1 vow closes it. We swear to bear the debt if the cut fails and the town falls through." Evan heard the vow like a yoke settling across his shoulders, heavy and inescapable. He did not shrug it off, could not, even if he wanted to. He did not welcome it either, but acceptance and welcome were different countries entirely. The first accusation of mourning rang across the square like a church bell announcing the end of the world. A boy pointed at his father and wept as if the mirror had burned his tongue with truths too hot to swallow. A dog howled and would not stop, as if it could smell the fear that was about to consume everything decent in the town. Pike counted cartridges again, his lips moving in silent arithmetic. Bell chewed a match to splinters and watched the rooftops with the patience of a hawk. Miss Calder checked the knot of her hair and said nothing at all, but her silence carried the weight of prayers that had no words. Evan spread his map on a barrel, studying the route one last time. The safe road narrowed to one thin line that even his finger could not fatten. From the square to the station, nothing else would hold against what was coming. 3 heartbeats, Rook reminded him, gentle as a prayer for the dead. Do not waste them on thinking about what might happen. Spend them on moving toward what must happen. Near sundown, Evan walked the anchor points once more. Bell tower, water tank, depot cornerstone. He put his palm on each stone and felt them hum like sleeping hives full of potential energy. He thanked them under his breath without naming who or what he was thanking, knowing only that gratitude was owed. The last night stretched like a wire drawn between 2 nails. It sang with every breath of wind that found it. No one slept so much as quit trying, knowing that morning would bring either salvation or reckoning. We walk when the circle forms, Evan said to his small band of survivors. We do not stop for voices from roofs or pleas from crowds. We do not deviate from the path, no matter what the mirror shows us. Rook nodded, and the band on his wrist settled against his skin as if sealing an agreement. Tomorrow would test every choice they had made to reach this moment. Tomorrow would show them what they were truly made of. They stepped into the street as the town gathered like grain before a threshing. Somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, a train dreamed of waking, and the clock in the square ticked backward toward an appointment that had been written in the stars before any of them were born. Dawn broke thin and gray, like a blade that had not been cleaned after its last use. The clock in the square ticked backward with purpose now, each second falling like drops of blood from a wound that would not heal. Every sound in Sable Ridge seemed to find the same rhythm. Heartbeats, footsteps, the whispered prayers of the desperate. Evan cinched his gun belt and checked each of his companions with a nod that carried the weight of final farewells. Pike tapped his cartridge belt, counting without words because numbers spoken aloud might become a curse. Bell tested the lever action on his rifle and stared at the street with eyes that had seen too many last stands. Rook stood calm as still water, wrists bound in iron, the clockwork band sleeping fitfully on his arm like a mechanical heart counting down to something beyond death. Miss Calder tied a scarf over her auburn hair and shut her medical bag with the finality of a casket lid. No one asked for prayers. Everyone hoped the day would not hear them and mistake hope for hubris. The sky mirror rested in its stone cradle like a black pond that reflected sins instead of light. It did not shine in the morning sun. It waited with the patience of a spider that had learned to weave webs from human weakness. Rook spoke low, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. When the bell gives the first stroke, the circle will draw itself in fire and intention. Then we move, Evan answered, and the town seemed to lean closer to listen, hungry for any scrap of certainty in the growing chaos. The first stroke rang from the tower, heavy as a hammer on the anvil of God's judgment. Lines of pale fire woke in the dust and began to creep forward like living snakes made of light. They bent around houses, flowed across porches, and wrapped the square in a noose of illumination that grew tighter with each passing second. People cried out and stepped back into the glow, feeling it warm against their boots like the breath of something vast and patient. Outside the light, the edges of things blurred and wavered, as if the world was forgetting its own outline. Reality grew thin at the borders, and thin places had a way of letting things fall through. Creed's men showed themselves like shadows on rooftops and in alley mouths, dark shapes that moved with predatory grace. No charge, no brave rush toward glory. They watched like wolves at a sheep pen, waiting for the flock to panic and scatter into their waiting teeth. A boy shouted accusations at his father's back, and the father would not turn to face the truth his son had learned from the merciless mirror. Two brothers staked each other with their eyes as if both had become strangers wearing familiar faces. Secrets had scalded the town like boiling water. Now the circle would cook what remained until only bones were left. Evan set his route with the precision of a surveyor mapping the road to salvation. Square to depot, depot to platform, platform to the door that led either to redemption or damnation. Nothing else would hold against the tide of chaos that was about to break over them like a wave. The second stroke rang, and dust rose as if kicked by the boots of invisible dancers, celebrating the end of all things. Creed stepped into full view on the livery roof, coat open to show the guns at his hip, hat tilted at an angle that made mock of the rising sun. He lifted one hand and the street grew quieter than it had any right to be, as if his gesture could command silence from the very air. "Mercer," he called, his voice rolling like water down a stone trough, smooth and inexorable. "No need to break your boots on hard ground. Trade the man for quiet, and everyone goes home to supper." He smiled like a knife being put back in his sheath, not because the cutting was done, but because it was being saved for later. Evan did not answer, would not dignify the offer with words. Rook breathed once and let it out slow, like a man releasing his last regret. The band made no sound, but its gears shifted with mechanical anticipation. The third stroke dragged a long moan from the tower bell, as if the bronze itself was in pain. The circle tightened another hand's width, compressing the safe ground like a fist slowly closing. A rancher stepped outside without looking, distracted by his wife's tears, and was gone before his hat finished falling, erased as completely as if he had never drawn breath. Miss Calder swallowed hard, then steadied her voice with the discipline that had seen her through a dozen emergencies. "Keep close to me," she said, her eyes moving from face to face. "I won't chase anyone outside the light, so don't make me choose between my oath and my life." Her eyes begged them not to make her face that choice, not to force her to abandon the principles that had made her who she was. "Anchors," Rook said, tilting his head toward the tower. "The water tank, the depot cornerstone, the 3 points that held Sable Ridge to the world like tent stakes driven deep into reality. Creed will test at least one before this is done." "We hold the line to the station," Evan replied with grim determination. "If one anchor breaks, we mend what we can and pray it holds." The fourth stroke found them halfway to the depot, moving at the pace of a funeral procession, fast enough to show purpose, slow enough to avoid panic. Two of Creed's riders rolled a cart into the street and pulled away a canvas tarp with theatrical flourish. Under it waited a brass canister fitted with a hand crank and a horn like the mouth of some mechanical demon. Pike whispered a curse that would have made his mother weep. Bell licked his lips nervously and raised his rifle to his shoulder. Rook spoke before either man could fire, his voice sharp with recognition and fear. "Ghost ash, the residue of erased souls. Don't let it touch your skin, or you'll join them in the space between heartbeats." The crank turned with a sound like bones breaking. A cloud like burned moonlight rushed from the horn and spread low over the ground. moving with purpose toward the shrinking circle of safety. Where it touched, the blue light of the boundary sagged and weakened, and footprints in the dust sank too deep, as if the earth itself was becoming uncertain of its own solidity. A merchant caught in the edge of the cloud coughed once, then looked surprised to see his own hands becoming translucent. He reached for his wife's sleeve, and his fingers passed through the fabric like mist through a spider's web. A moment later, both of them were reaching into emptiness, their voices echoing from somewhere that had no location. Evan's pistol barked twice, punching holes through the crankman's shoulder. The ash cloud wavered and began to dissipate. Bell put a bullet through the horn's brass mouth, and the machine coughed itself apart like a diseased lung, finally admitting defeat. Pike grabbed a door torn loose from its hinges and made a shield of splintered wood between them and the street. "Keep moving," he shouted, blood from a splinter cut painting his cheek red. "Don't let them pin us down." The fifth stroke rang with the authority of Judgment Day. Rook flinched as if struck. The band twitched against his wrist like a living thing in pain. "Right roof," he said, and Evan's gun barked twice at an angle that seemed impossible until a rifle clattered down from above, followed by a man's scream of pain. Creed did not move to anger or frustration. He leaned against the chimney and watched the dance of violence with the appreciation of a connoisseur. "Ledger's still hungry," he murmured, not loud enough to be heard clearly, but somehow audible to every ear that mattered. The circle took another step inward, its glow rising to calf height. Everyone stood a little straighter, a little more careful, knowing that one stumble might mean erasure. The safe ground was becoming precious as water in the desert. Two of Creed's men reached the bell tower base carrying canvas sacks that bulged with ominous weight. Rook's voice went dry as desert wind. "Black powder. They mean to bring down the anchor." Pike threw the door shield aside and ran without waiting to be ordered, his boots drumming against the dusty ground. Evan fired to cover his advance, bullets chipping stone and sending Creed's men diving for whatever protection they could find. Bell cursed creatively and added his rifle to the covering fire. Miss Calder followed Pike with a roll of bandage in one fist, ready to bind wounds or tie tourniquets as the situation demanded. They met the saboteurs at the tower steps in a collision of flesh and metal and desperate intention. Pike hit the first man in the ribs with his shoulder, driving the breath from the saboteur's lungs and sending the powder sack spilling black sand across the stone foundation. Bell took the second man at the knee with his rifle butt, then followed up with a blow to the jaw that sent teeth flying like scattered dice. A third figure rose from behind the steps with a pistol already burning powder. The muzzle flashed, bright as a fallen star. Rook shouted a warning, but 3 heartbeats came too late for anyone but himself. Pike turned toward the sound, eyes wide with the realization that his luck had finally run out, and the bullet took him high in the chest, just above the pocket where he kept his tobacco and his wife's last letter. He sat down as if a chair had been offered to him by a polite host. Miss Calder was on her knees before his hat stopped rolling, her hands already working to stem the tide of red that was painting his shirt a color no laundress could ever wash clean. "Hold the tower," Pike wheezed, then coughed blood that looked too bright in the morning light, like rubies scattered on snow. Evan ran them back toward the circle before grief could steal their feet and root them in place to mourn. Bell's jaw worked silently, trying to find words that could carry the weight of watching a good man die. Rook stepped between them and the street, iron on his wrists but steel in his eyes, his body a barrier between his protectors and the bullets that sought them. The 6th stroke rang like a death knell. Sable Ridge was smaller than it had ever been, compressed by forces that cared nothing for human comfort or dignity. The water tank hummed with tension, the kind of hum a hive makes when it must choose between survival and collapse. Creed called again from his perch, lazy as a cat stretched across a sunny porch. "Trade while there's still breath left to bargain with. You won't like the next trick I've got planned for your entertainment." 2 more of his men wheeled a second machine into the narrowing funnel of safe ground. This contraption had a drum like a player piano and a bellows system connected to an array of tubes like organ pipes arranged for some hellish symphony. Rook hissed through his teeth with recognition and dread. Sound splitter. It phrased the edges of reality itself, makes solid things forget how to hold together. They began to crank the mechanism, and the air itself tore in ribbons that couldn't be seen until they cut something. A fence post sheared cleanly in half without falling, then toppled in two different directions as if gravity couldn't decide which way was down. A hen clucked twice in harmony with herself, then fell silent as the sound waves carved her existence into incompatible frequencies. Evan stepped into the narrowing funnel and planted his feet like a man making his final stand. He waited with the patience of a hunter until the second crankman leaned forward to admire the chaos his machine was creating. Then Evan's pistol spoke its piece, punching a hole through the bellows, and the sound splitter began to devour its own mechanical tongue in a cascade of discordant notes. The seventh stroke rang with finality. The circle kissed porch boards and windowsills, forcing families to lift children onto railings to keep them within the shrinking boundary of safety. Men hoisted wives in their arms rather than risk a single step outside the light. From the stone pedestal at the square's heart, the lantern of truth woke without visible illumination, but with a presence that pressed against every soul within reach. It breathed like a living thing awakening from ancient sleep. The sky mirror rose another hand's width, and faces swam in its dark surface like fish in a poisoned stream. "Make it stop," someone begged the indifferent air. "Please, make it stop," someone else echoed, her voice cracking with the weight of secrets she'd kept buried for decades. The mirror showed no mercy because it was not programmed for compassion. It was only a page being turned by an unseen hand that cared nothing for human comfort. Rook leaned close to Evan, his words barely audible above the growing hysteria. "Creed uses the town's panic like a windbreak," he explained with tactical clarity. "He'll move when we move. Try to take us from behind when our attention is on the path ahead." "Let him want our backs," Evan said grimly. "We'll give him the front view and make sure he doesn't like what he sees." They began to walk the final 100 yards at a pace that balanced urgency with dignity, fast enough to show purpose, slow enough to avoid the mistakes that came with panic. The eighth stroke rang and left a tremor in the ground that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere earth. The railroad tracks sang with harmonics that belonged to no earthly instrument, and the station lamps sputtered before burning steady as if cupped by protective hands. The funnel of safety grew so narrow that two men walking abreast would brush shoulders, and every step required careful placement. A rifle cracked from the depot roof like breaking timber. Bell returned fire and fell to one knee when a splinter the size of a railroad spike caught his thigh and opened it to the bone. Miss Calder dragged him into the meager protection of a bench, her hands working with the swift efficiency that had saved lives from here to Santa Fe. "Go!" she snapped without looking up from the wound, her voice sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Go now, or Pike dies for nothing but the privilege of watching us fail." Bell grabbed Evan's sleeve with fingers slick with his own blood. "Make it count, deputy. Make every step and every bullet count for something." His voice carried no tremor despite the pain, only the steady resolve of a man who had chosen his hill to die on and found it acceptable. Creed's laughter drifted down from above, a short bark of amusement. "You're close enough to hear the ledger pages turning," he called with mock helpfulness. "Close enough to know you can't read the writing and won't like the bill when it comes due." Rook looked at the platform steps like a man measuring the dimensions of his own grave. "The band will speak its warnings soon," he said with the certainty of prophecy, "and the train door will wait for two names to open what should perhaps remain closed." The ninth stroke bent the very nature of the day, making light seem thin and shadow appear sharp enough to cut. A wind arrived from a direction that appeared on no compass, carrying scents of places that had never known rain and sounds of voices that had never drawn breath. The circle rose to knee height, pushing against their legs like an incoming tide of liquid light. Evan felt it press against his shins with insistence that was almost alive. He pushed back with muscles and willpower, refusing to be moved by forces he couldn't understand, but could certainly resist. A woman stumbled on the uneven ground and fell forward, both hands plunging into the glow before anyone could catch her. Her fingers went thin as spider silk, and when Miss Calder tried to pull her back to safety, there was nothing solid left to grasp, only the memory of warmth and the echo of a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Rook caught Evan's sleeve with his bound hands. "Eyes forward," he said, and there was genuine apology in the warning. Look back and you'll join her in the space between seconds, where the lost go to be forgotten. They reached the bottom of the platform steps as the sun reached its zenith overhead. The funnel ended there in a bright coin of ground that would grow no larger no matter how desperately they might wish for more room to maneuver. Evan had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders within the boundary of safety, and even then he could feel the light lapping at his heels like hungry flames. Creed raised 2 fingers in a gesture that might have been a benediction in another context. Rifles on 3 separate rooftops answered his silent command with enthusiasm. Boards leaped and splintered. Posts spat fragments like angry hornets. A painted sign advertising the general store spun on its chain until the chain snapped and sent it clattering into the dust. The clockwork band hummed as if a mechanical wasp had taken up residence beneath the brass housing. Left, then duck low, Rook murmured with the calm of a man reading the weather, and Evan crouched before he consciously decided to obey. A bullet argued loudly with the brick wall behind his head and lost the debate in a spray of mortar and fragments. The 10th stroke announced itself with a tremor that ran through bone and settled in the marrow. The railroad tracks at the eastern edge of vision drew a line of silver as clean and sharp as a razor's edge across the throat of the world. The air began to smell like rain in a place that had never learned the language of storms. Bell hobbled toward them with a bandage that Miss Calder had tied tight as a promise around his wounded thigh. He took position without asking for orders, understanding that some battles required every gun that could still fire. His rifle settled against his shoulder like a bird coming home to roost, familiar and deadly. Creed's smile thinned to a line sharp enough to draw blood. Last chance. Mercer. Final offer before the market closes. There was never a first chance, Evan answered, and discovered in the speaking that this had always been true, that every choice had led to this moment like tributaries flowing toward an inevitable river. The 11th stroke rolled from the tower with the weight of finality itself. Children stopped crying because there was no breath left to spare for tears. Men forgot to curse because there was no God present to hear their blasphemy and be offended. The sky mirror lifted another inch and held steady as a judge's gavel. A face floated to the surface of the dark glass, one that Evan knew better than his own reflection. His wife, Sarah, laughing in the light of a day that had never happened, reaching toward him from a future that had died in a hospital room 7 years past. He did not look away from the vision, did not reach toward the impossible warmth of that smile. He let the picture pass like dust motes dancing in sunlight. Beautiful, brief, and gone. Rook saw the choice and the pain it cost, bowing his head once in acknowledgement of a strength that deserved recognition. The 12th stroke bowed the light across the platform like a rainbow made of silver fire. Evan felt the entire town tilt toward the railroad tracks as if the world itself was trying to pour everything toward that single point of departure. The horizon opened like a seam being picked by patient, invisible fingers. Creed's men shifted their weight without moving their boots, like predators preparing to spring. The town made a sound that was neither word nor prayer, but something between the two. A collective release of breath that carried the weight of surrender. The station doors trembled in their frames. The rails flashed once with light that came from no earthly source. Something tall and dark and impossibly long slid into the notch that reality had opened to receive it. The 313 arrived without smoke, without the shower of cinders that marked honest locomotives, without acknowledging any God that decent folk might recognize. Wind slammed against the platform hard enough to rattle teeth, then reversed direction and sucked away with such force that lamp flames flattened to horizontal sheets before standing upright again with better posture than before. Dust rose and shaped itself into spirals that couldn't agree on which direction was up, creating small cyclones that danced like dervishes, celebrating the end of natural law. The train's skin drank daylight and gave back only darkness. Windows pooled black as deep wells where a man might see his reflection but never recognize his own face. Brass lines ran its entire length like veins under black leather gloves, pulsing with a rhythm that had nothing to do with any human heartbeat. No whistle now, not yet. No bell to announce arrival. Only a low note like a voice humming contentedly behind a door that should not be opened. The circle sealed itself at the platform's edge with finality. Those within the light stood together whether they had loved or hated each other in the time before. Differences of opinion seemed petty when measured against the possibility of complete erasure. Those who had been caught outside were no longer present to voice complaints about the arrangement. A seam appeared in the side of the foremost carriage, widening like a mouth learning to speak words in a language older than human civilization. Behind the opening waited a darkness that could be smelled, metal and oil, and the promise of rain that would never fall on any ground that maps could locate. Evan reached for Rook's chain and felt the prisoner already moving forward, accepting the inevitable with the grace of a man who had always known this moment would come. Miss Calder looked up once from Belle's bandaged leg and gave a nod that was meant for no one in particular and everyone who might understand its meaning. Belle lifted his chin toward the rooftops where Creed's men waited and smiled without humor. The expression of a man who had found peace with violent mathematics. Creed removed his hat as if a religious service were beginning, showing respect for forces that commanded it whether they deserved it or not. "The door's standing open," he called with theatrical courtesy. "Tell the ledger keeper that Harlan Creed sent you with his compliments." The station clock had no more seconds to lay down like cards in a poker game where everyone was bluffing and no one could afford to fold. The tower bell held its bronze tongue in respectful silence. Sable Ridge did not dare to breathe. Evan put his boot on the first step leading up to the platform, feeling the wood solid beneath his weight. The band on Rook's wrist sang 3 clear notes like silver bells, then went silent as a grave. Together, with the diminished town at their backs and the glowing circle around their ankles like shackles made of light, they faced the dark mouth of the railway carriage and waited for it to decide whether to invite them in or devour them where they stood. The carriage swallowed them whole, then breathed them into a narrow hallway that existed in the spaces between what was and what might be. The air tasted of oil, brass, and shadow, the distinctive flavor of rain that had never learned to fall on honest ground. Behind them, the door stitched itself shut with mechanical precision, as if it feared contamination by ordinary daylight. Evan kept one hand on Rook's chain and the other resting on the grip of his revolver, though he suspected that conventional weapons would prove as useful as prayers against what they might encounter. Belle limped behind them, his wounded leg painting small drops of defiance on the floor with every step. Miss Calder brought up the rear, counting potential exits with the methodical attention that had kept her patients alive through dozens of frontier emergencies. A low hum ran through the walls like a hymn being sung through clenched teeth by a congregation that had forgotten the words but remembered the tune. The sound was almost musical, but music implied harmony, and this carried undertones of mechanical precision that had nothing to do with human comfort. "Straight ahead," Rook said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man returning to a childhood home that had never been welcoming. "The gauge room sits where the carriages overlap, the heart of the operation, where Aurelia keeps her most important records." His words echoed strangely in the confined space, as if the corridor was longer than it appeared. For a heartbeat, the floor beneath their boots belonged to a different train entirely. Warmer wood, different grain pattern, the ghost of carpet that had been removed decades ago. Then reality reasserted itself and agreed to maintain consistent laws of physics, at least for the moment. Brass plaques mounted at regular intervals named destinations that appeared on no earthly map. Array, ledger, datum, places that existed in the spaces between other places. Way stations for journeys that began and ended in the same impossible location. A metal grill snapped open overhead without warning. Dust fell like silver fish swimming through air thick as water. The sound of boots echoed from the crawl space above. Creed's men had found their own way aboard. Belle rolled sideways with practiced efficiency and fired through the metal mesh. The muzzle flashed bright as a falling star in the confined darkness. Miss Calder grabbed his shoulder and dragged him clear of the return fire that chewed splinters from the corridor walls. "Keep moving," she hissed. "Standing still in this place is the same as dying slowly." The mechanical hum thickened and deepened until a voice rode its waves like a ship on a dark ocean. Female, precise, and completely without mercy or malice. "Approach verified. 2 names required for access to primary systems. Together then," Rook said, and pushed against a copper door that had no visible handle but opened at his touch like a flower responding to sunlight. The gauge room beyond was circular and ribbed like the inside of a massive bell, bright without any visible source of illumination. At its center rose a dark column veined with lines of slow-moving light that pulsed like the heartbeat of something vast and patient. A brass table stood before the column like a pulpit in a church dedicated to mathematics instead of salvation. "The gauge room," Rook murmured with something approaching reverence, "where orders are written and debts are recorded in ledgers that never balance." Evan read the brass nameplate mounted on the table's surface. "Cut, override." Below it, in smaller letters that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, "Debt borne by signatories in perpetuity." The implications of those words settled on his shoulders like a coat made of lead. "Aurelia acknowledges the presence of Cassian Rook and Deputy Evan Mercer," the voice said with the courtesy of a bank clerk explaining foreclosure procedures. "State your petition clearly and accept the terms without negotiation." "Stay the cut on Sable Ridge," Rook answered formally. "Anchor the town to the half layer and let it remain where it belongs." Silence changed color from expectant to calculating. "Petition denied," Aurelia replied with politeness that cut deeper than contempt. "Cohesion parameters below acceptable margins. The cut will proceed as scheduled." Evan stepped forward, his boot heels ringing against the metal floor. "Add my name to his. I will bear whatever debt is required." The words left his mouth before his mind could counsel caution, driven by something deeper than thought and more reliable than hope. The silence that followed had weight in substance, pressing against them like deep water. "Vow accepted pending proper witness and security," Aurelia said finally. "Phrase the binding oath according to established protocols." Evan laid his palm flat against the brass surface, feeling the metal warm beneath his skin. "If the cut fails and the town falls through the layers of reality, I will carry the weight of their loss. I will bear the debt of their preservation until it is paid in full." Heat passed through his bones like whiskey, but whiskey had never burned with such cold fire. "Petition recorded and accepted," Aurelia said with satisfaction. "Proceed with security verification and proof of intent." The pulpit opened with mechanical precision, revealing a socket shaped like a human hand, or perhaps something that had once been human before it learned better. The clockwork band around Rook's wrist clicked awake with sudden eagerness, its gears spinning faster than they had since the moment of its creation. "3 heartbeats to make this count," Rook whispered, and fed the device into the waiting socket with the care of a man loading his last bullet. Metal met metal with a sound like a lock deciding to be honest for the first time in its existence. The room trembled in ways that had nothing to do with mechanical vibration and everything to do with fundamental forces being rearranged. Words etched themselves into the air in letters made of light. Sync 21. 33. 46. Outside the gauge room. Thunder rolled without any cloud to birth it, rattling the frame of the impossible train. A seam unzipped in the solid wall, as if reality was a garment that could be tailored to fit new requirements. Harlan Creed stepped through the opening with the casual confidence of winter arriving ahead of schedule. His pistol was already in his hand, already pointed at the most important targets, already prepared to write the ending to this story in powder and lead. Bell's rifle spoke first, the bullet kissing a rail and becoming a ricochet that sparked off brass fixtures. The central column dimmed as energy was diverted to repair systems. Sync numbers faltered and began to slide backward. "Interference detected," Aurelia announced with the mild annoyance of a librarian dealing with disruptive patrons. "Remove noise from the system immediately." "Creed's got warp charges," Rook coughed, tasting blood from exertion and fear. "They cut through the edges of space itself. Reality doesn't heal clean from those wounds." Evan edged between Creed and the column, making himself a human shield for the mechanism that represented their only hope. "I thought you wanted this town kept quiet and peaceful." "I want stillness," Creed corrected with the patience of a teacher explaining simple concepts to a slow student. "Silence is merely a byproduct of proper stillness. Death is the ultimate peace." He produced a brass egg from his coat pocket and tossed it underhand toward the base of the column. Evan shot it out of the air. Clear threads spilled like liquid light and made colors step sideways into spectrums that had no names. Miss Calder pulled Belle behind the dubious protection of the brass pulpit. "Keep that band connected," she ordered Rook. "Whatever it costs, don't let the link be severed." Creed walked closer with the unhurried confidence of a pastor delivering a sermon to a captive congregation. He fired twice at the column's base. The room lost a crucial note from its mechanical hymn, and the sync numbers wavered: 58, 61, 57. Rook gritted his teeth against pain that went deeper than flesh. "Hold the connection. Whatever happens, hold it steady." Evan abandoned gunplay for close-quarters work, rushing Creed and slamming his shoulder into the outlaw's chest. They traded elbow strikes and curses. A warp charge grazed the altar's edge and aged one corner by a full decade in the space between heartbeats. Miss Calder smashed a vial of something medicinal against Creed's gun hand. Evan used the distraction to drive his forehead into the outlaw's nose with a sound like breaking kindling. "Keep him away from the band," Rook called as the device screamed. Thin metal pushed beyond its design limits, making a sound that made teeth ache and eyes water. Sync 74, 81. The floor tugged at their boots like an outgoing tide. Creed drew a knife that looked like a sliver of concentrated midnight and swept it toward the nearest rail connection. The blade parted metal without resistance or sound, leaving edges so clean they seemed to heal themselves. "Anchor's failing," Rook warned through clenched teeth. "Keep him away from the critical connections." Belle put a bullet through Creed's knife hand. The impossible blade rang like a struck bell as it hit the brass floor and lay there like a piece of crystallized winter. Outside the gauge room, the train remembered that it possessed a whistle and used it to voice a sound that had nothing to do with steam or air pressure. Creed threw another warp egg at the ceiling with his undamaged hand. It burst in a cascade of impossible physics. For a heartbeat, stars stared down through a rent in the roof that opened onto a night sky that belonged to no earthly location. Dust became snow, then transformed into salt, then returned to being dust again, as if the universe was shuffling through possibilities like a dealer with marked cards. Sync 89, 92, 90. The numbers hesitated like a horse approaching a bridge it didn't trust. "One more proof of intent required," Aurelia announced with bureaucratic precision. "Name the specific burden you accept in exchange for intervention." "A child pulled from the cut at Blue Water Crossing," Rook answered without hesitation. "A girl with no name in any ledger. Let the town stand as security for her existence. I'll pay whatever additional price is demanded." Evan stepped forward and added his voice to the binding oath. "Write my name alongside his. Whatever debt this incurs, we'll carry it together." Pain bright as lightning illuminated the column from base to apex. "Terms accepted and recorded," Aurelia said with something that might have been satisfaction. "Agreement sealed and witnessed." Creed kicked the brass altar hard enough to rattle every connection. The band jolted and sync slipped toward failure. 86, 84. Evan caught Rook's chain between his bound hands and held the prisoner upright by the very bonds that imprisoned him. "Stay with me," he ordered. "Don't let the connection break now." "Where else would I go?" Rook laughed, blood speckling his lips. "This is where the story ends. One way or another." Creed dove for his fallen knife and hurled it toward a critical anchor point with desperate accuracy. Belle stepped into its path with nothing but his wounded body as a shield, taking the impossible blade in his chest rather than let it sever connections that held reality together. The knife went through him and struck brass, but the impact was robbed of its cutting force by the sacrifice that had intercepted it. Evan hit Creed with everything he had: fist, elbow, knee, and the accumulated fury of watching good people die for the sake of abstract ledger entries. The outlaw folded around the blow like paper crumpling. Time itself seemed to skip a beat as violence reached its natural conclusion. Sync 95, 97. The room sang that low, inevitable note of systems aligning perfectly. Miss Calder wept once, a single tear for Belle, for Pike, for all the prices that had been paid, and did not wipe her face, letting grief mark her as it would. Creed drew a final pistol with his last functional hand and aimed for Rook's heart, determined that if he couldn't prevent the salvation, he could at least make it cost more than anyone wanted to pay. Evan turned toward the sound of the gun cocking and knew with crystalline clarity that he was slower than bullets. Bell was not. Even with his life bleeding away, he threw himself between the gun and its target, taking the shot that was meant for another man. The bullet folded him like a book closing, but his sacrifice bought them the seconds they needed. Miss Calder said Bell's name once, and the word carried across the mechanical space like a flare calling for help that would never arrive. 3 heartbeats, Rook whispered for what he knew would be the final time. He wrenched against his chains and slammed his shoulder into the altar with every ounce of strength his battered body could summon. The socket bit down on the clockwork band with mechanical hunger. The device sang like a struck tuning fork, its voice rising to frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the bones. Sync 100. Locked and sealed. The column rose from ember glow to the brightness of a new morning, casting shadows that fell in all the right directions. Sable Ridge anchored successfully, Aurelia announced with professional satisfaction. Cut order stayed indefinitely. Terms accepted and binding. Everything that had been holding its breath let it go at once. Outside the gauge room, the circle of light unwound like a lariat being coiled by an expert hand. Inside, the room settled its weight back onto foundations that would hold for as long as the terms were honored. Creed fired twice more, once from habit, once from hate that had nowhere else to go. One bullet chipped brass, the other went wide and struck nothing more important than air. He saw that the numbers were locked beyond his power to change and back toward the seam that had brought him into this place. Another day, then, he said with the weary acceptance of a man who fought battles that never truly ended. There's always another day, another town, another ledger that needs balancing. Evan shot him through the shoulder and pinned that promise to bone and sinew. Creed fell back through the dimensional seam the way he had entered, sideways to reality and wrong in every direction that mattered. The opening stitched itself shut with finality, and the room's mechanical hum returned to the patient rhythm of properly functioning machinery. Miss Calder pressed both hands against the wound in Bell's chest, blood that flowed like news of defeat but carried the message of victory won at the highest possible price. Stay with us, she ordered, but her voice carried no real hope and all the authority of someone who had learned to argue with death and occasionally win. Bell looked at Evan with eyes that were already focused on something beyond the gauge room walls. His lips moved without sound, but the shape of the words was clear. Worth it. All of it. Worth it. His voice carried no tremor, despite the pain that was eating him alive. Only the steady resolve of a man who had chosen his final battle and found it acceptable. Rook sagged against the altar, the clockwork band cool against his wrist like a spent cartridge. The device had given everything it had to give. Its gears no longer turned, and its voice was permanently stilled. Aurelia to petitioners, the mechanical voice said with bureaucratic formality. The locomotive will depart according to schedule. Passengers should disembark at the next designated stop. Evan kept one hand on Rook's shoulder and pressed the other against the warm brass of the altar. Record this addendum to our agreement. No lantern of truth in Sable Ridge without the town's explicit consent. No more circles drawn without their permission. No more cuts scheduled without proper notification and appeal process. The silence that followed was longer than the previous pauses, as if Aurelia was consulting references that took time to locate. Addendum recorded and accepted, she finally answered. Review and revision protocols acknowledged. Future interventions subject to established procedures? It was not mercy. Mercy was a human concept that had no place in mechanical logic. But it was noticed that the rules could be changed, and that was more than most towns ever managed to extract from the Halcyon line. The copper door unstitched itself with the same precision that had sealed it, and wind brought the sense of dust and sunlight in the honest world they had been fighting to preserve. They carried Bell toward that familiar reality step by careful step, with Rook following under the weight of a debt he was proud to bear. The burden of salvation was heavy, but it was a load that could be shared between strong shoulders and determined hearts. On the platform, the remnants of Sable Ridge waited, smaller than it had been at dawn, but whole in ways that mattered more than numbers. The sky mirror slept peacefully in its stone cradle, and the circle of compulsion was gone, as completely as if it had never existed. Behind them, the impossible train made ready to depart like a visiting judge who had concluded his business and found the court's decisions acceptable. "Go," Rook told the locomotive softly, as if speaking to a horse that had carried them faithfully through dangerous country. "Go before the ledger finds new reasons to stay." The 313 slid back into the dimensional seam it had carved through the morning, and ordinary light grew honest again as the gap between worlds sealed itself. The price had been paid in full, and the receipt was written in blood, sweat, and the promises of men who meant to keep their word no matter what it cost them. The train slid away into the seam between seconds, taking with it the weight of impossible choices and leaving behind only the quiet that follows storms. No whistle marked its departure. No smoke traced its passage. Just the silence it left behind, raw and trembling like a wound learning to heal. The platform creaked with the sound of ordinary wood, remembering how to be ordinary. Evan held Rook steady by the chain that bound them together in more ways than iron, while Miss Calder worked to keep Belle's life from flowing away through holes that bullets had punched in his chest. His blood marked the weathered planks like red coins that no bank would honor, but which purchased something more valuable than gold. The townsfolk stepped carefully from the buildings where they had taken shelter, moving like people waking from dreams that had been too real and too terrible to be anything but true. No glow remained in the square. No shrinking circle threatened to erase the unwary. No mirror burned their secrets into public shame. Only dust and faces afraid to breathe too loud, afraid that noise might summon back what had finally agreed to leave them in peace. Creed's remaining riders had scattered when their leader fell through sideways reality. Some slipped into alleys that led to nowhere. Some melted into the hills like snow before spring sun. The town did not pursue them. There had been enough hunting for one day, and revenge was a luxury they could not afford. Evan helped Miss Calder lift Belle onto a bench beneath the station eaves, where shade fell like a benediction. She pressed clean cloth against wounds that leaked life with each heartbeat, whispering words that might have been prayers, or might have been the medical incantations she used to argue with death. Belle's eyes wandered across the sky before settling on Evan's face with the clarity that sometimes comes when everything else becomes unimportant. "Worth it," he said again, his voice thinner than paper but stronger than steel. "Every drop, every breath, every step that brought us here. Worth it." Evan gripped his shoulder with hands that knew the weight of promises kept. "The town will remember. Your name will be spoken when they tell this story." Belle smiled at that, understanding that some forms of immortality were better than others. Children began to gather in the square, clinging to their mothers' skirts but no longer weeping. Men held their hats with hands that still trembled, but trembled now with relief instead of terror. No cheers rose from the crowd. No celebration marked their salvation. Only the slow release of breath that had been held too long. The iron clock in the square still stood frozen, its hands locked at 3:13. Its face no longer moved with mechanical precision, but every glance toward it carried the memory of moments when time itself had been negotiable. Some scars were meant to be kept as reminders. Rook leaned heavily against a post, his face pale as winter morning, lips cracked from dehydration and the strain of bearing witness to forces too large for human comprehension. The clockwork band around his wrist was cracked where the altar had bitten it, its brass surface dulled like a coin that had been handled too much. It no longer hummed with mechanical life. "Will you live?" Evan asked, though the question encompassed more than mere breathing. Rook gave a crooked grin that had seen too much and forgiven more. 3 heartbeats left in the device, maybe a few thousand left in me. I'll spend them when they matter most. His voice carried the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found purpose in the most unlikely places. From the stone pedestal at the square's heart came a faint hum, not threatening now, but almost contemplative. The lantern of truth did not rise from its resting place, but a single spark drifted upward like an ember from a dying fire. Aurelia's voice lingered in the air, quiet and almost human in its restraint. Petition recorded. Review promised. Terms acknowledged. It was not mercy. Mercy required understanding of pain, and machines felt no pain to understand. But it was recognition that contracts could be renegotiated, and that was more than most towns ever extracted from forces beyond their comprehension. The townsfolk stirred uneasily, glancing toward the dormant pedestal with the wariness of people who had learned that sleep and death were different conditions entirely. Would the mirror return tomorrow, rising like a black sun to burn their secrets into public shame? Or would it sleep forever, content with the promises that had been made in brass and blood? No one asked these questions aloud. Some answers were too dangerous to seek. Evan walked slowly to the center of the square, his boots raising small puffs of dust that settled like benedictions on ground that had seen too much history compressed into too few hours. He placed his palm against the iron clock's cold face, feeling metal that had absorbed the chill of forces that recognized no earthly seasons. The touch brought memories, a hospital door that had remained closed, a letter marked denied in script that had ended more than one life, a wife's face in a window framed by light that would never return, but also Belle's sacrifice, Pike's courage, and Rook's willingness to bear burdens that belonged to no single man. He spoke softly, but the town leaned forward to catch every word as if they were seeds that might grow into better tomorrows. No more mirrors without our consent. No more circles drawn around us like nooses. No more cuts scheduled without our knowledge. Some nodded, understanding flooding their faces like sunrise. Others looked down at the dust, not yet ready to believe that they had earned the right to negotiate with forces that move between the spaces of the world. But the seed of those words sank deeper than fear, taking root in soil that had been watered with the blood of good men. It was the first claim of ownership the town had made in decades, not of property or gold, but of the right to exist on their own terms. As dusk painted the western sky the color of old blood, they buried Pike in the churchyard, where wildflowers grew despite the harsh soil. Belle was carried there too, still breathing, though each breath came harder than the last. Miss Calder sat at his side with the patience of someone who had learned that death was not an enemy to be defeated, but a natural process to be witnessed with dignity. She held his hand and spoke quietly of things that mattered: the sunrise he had seen that morning, the children who would grow up free from circles of compulsion, the choice he had made to stand between bullets and the innocent. Belle squeezed her fingers once and smiled at something only he could see. "Tell them," he whispered. "Tell them it was worth every heartbeat." He closed his eyes as the first stars appeared, and his breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the evening wind through the grass. When it stopped, the silence that followed was different from the silence that had marked the train's departure. Softer, more accepting, touched with the peace that comes when debts are paid in full. Rook stood apart from the gathering, watching the sun lower into red dust that painted the horizon like watercolors bleeding together. The chain still bound his wrists, but no one held the other end. He was a prisoner now only by his own choice, accepting the consequences of actions taken for reasons that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with justice. A little girl drifted away from the crowd of mourners, her dress torn and travel-stained, her shoes lost somewhere in the chaos of the day. She clutched a wooden horse carved rough but sturdy, holding it as if it contained all the certainty left in a world that had proven itself capable of impossible transformations. Whispers followed her movement. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why did she seem to exist in the spaces between other people's attention? But Evan knew without asking, recognition striking him like a physical blow. She was the child Rook had spoken of, the girl pulled from the cut at Blue Water Crossing, the debt for which they had mortgaged their futures. Her eyes found Rook across the gathering crowd, and for the first time since Evan had met him, the prisoner's face softened into something approaching peace. 3 heartbeats left in his mechanical oracle, but he gave one away in the smile that passed between them. Protector and protected, linked by bonds that no chain could represent. The girl approached slowly, stopping just outside arm's reach. She held up the wooden horse as if making an offering, and when Rook knelt to accept it, she whispered something too quiet for other ears to catch. He nodded gravely and whispered something back. Then she drifted away again, disappearing into the crowd like morning mist touched by sun. The night came with honest darkness. No supernatural glow. No hum of power running beneath the ground like an underground river. Only the thin songs of crickets returning to their ancient duty of marking time in measurements that human hearts could understand. Stars appeared one by one, familiar constellations taking their appointed places in a sky that had remembered how to follow natural laws. The air smelled of dust and cooling stone, and the faint promise of rain that might actually fall. Evan sat on the station steps with his hat in his hands, feeling the weight of choices that had led him through fire and brought him out changed but not broken. The square was nearly empty now, save for a few oil lamps casting pools of yellow light that stayed where they were put. Dust swirled in patterns too small and random to inspire fear, just wind being wind, obeying physics instead of malevolent intention. He thought of Aurelia's voice, precise and cold as winter mathematics. He thought of Creed slipping back into whatever shadows would accept him, carrying wounds and grudges that would fester until they found new expression. And he thought of the promise that nothing was ever truly finished in this business, only pause between movements in a symphony too large for human comprehension. The girl with the wooden horse curled up near Miss Calder, who had wrapped Belle in a blanket and was sitting vigil with the dedication of someone who understood that witness was sometimes the only gift left to give. Rook stared at the frozen clock with eyes that held depths measured in heartbeats rather than years. "It could start again," he said quietly. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. The Halcyon line has a long memory and longer patience." "Then we'll be ready," Evan replied, and discovered that he meant it. "We know their methods now. We know that deals can be negotiated and terms can be set. We know that good people willing to pay the price can hold the line." He folded the paper on which he had written their names, some crossed out by death, others underlined by sacrifice, all of them transformed by the weight of choices made when choosing mattered most. He placed it under the cornerstone step of the station, letting it belong to the ground and the community it represented. Tomorrow, they would repair fences, rehang doors, and sweep up the glass and splinters left by violence. Life would press forward with the stubborn persistence of mesquite in drought, putting down roots wherever it could find purchase. But no one in Sable Ridge would ever look at shadows the same way again. They had learned that darkness could have purpose, that light could be a trap, and that the most important battles were fought not for gold or glory, but for the right to wake up tomorrow in a world that still made sense. The desert wind returned as the hour grew late, softer now and carrying no threat. It brought the scent of sage and distant water, the promise of rain that might come with the changing season. And in the gentle hush that followed, Evan felt the town take its first truly free breath in longer than anyone could remember. He pulled his hat low, stood, and faced the square where ordinary people had done extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. Somewhere far to the east, a faint echo of rails whispered across impossible distances. Reminder that the Halcyon line still ran its routes through the thin places of the world. The train had not gone forever. Aurelia still kept her ledgers, still balanced equations that dealt in human suffering and supernatural intervention. Other towns would face their own moments of reckoning, their own choices between salvation and erasure. But tonight, Sable Ridge belonged to its people, not to Aurelia's mathematics, not to Creed's ambitions. Theirs. The cost had been counted in blood and measured in heartbeats, but the price had been paid by men and women who chose to stand when standing mattered. The receipt was written in the survival of children who would grow up free, in the continuation of a community that had earned the right to define its own future. As Evan walked toward the hotel and whatever rest he might find, he heard Miss Calder humming a lullaby to the sleeping girl. The melody was simple and human and absolutely ordinary, the most beautiful sound he had heard in years. Behind him, the iron clock stood silent, its hands frozen at the moment when everything changed. Ahead of him, morning would come in its own good time, bringing ordinary light to an extraordinary place that had learned to appreciate the gift of being ordinary. The western wind sang its ancient songs, and for the first time in memory, They were songs of peace. Thank you for riding the rails with us through this tale of the supernatural frontier. If this story moved you like a train through the night, share it with fellow travelers and let the spirit of the Weird West live on. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss the next journey into the shadows and light of West Dream Tales. The tracks run deep, and there are always more stories waiting at the next station.